Hey guys, and welcome to Tnashi's Movie Corner. Today it's me, Brad, giving you the rundown of what is different or even similar between the Warcraft movie and the games as I remember them. Now remember, this is purely based off of what I remember from reading a long while back. So there are some things even I might not be so clear on. But from what I remember, this is what we're looking at. I guess to start off, we're going to talk about how the orcs got to the world where Azeroth is. Now, in both versions of the story, it's the Guardian who more or less helps Gul'dan cross this bridge. However, in the original games, the reason that this was done was entirely different. The Guardian wanted Gul'dan's help in taking out Azeroth. I don't really remember the why of it, but I do know that he wanted the Horde to help him achieve this goal. And Gul'dan, in turn, was promised the location of the demon's tomb, which the demon does manifest a little bit here, but it's centered on the Guardian instead of what Gul'dan's ultimate objective is. So that's a little bit of a difference, because Gul'dan was seeking out this tomb because he wanted the hidden knowledge within it, the hidden powers. But in here, his powers that he's seeking is tied almost entirely to the Fel, which is very different. Speaking of which, Gul'dan himself is a very different character between the two. In the games, Gul'dan is part of the Shadow Council, which actually rules the Horde from behind the scenes. And in fact, Blackhand, who is the leader of the Horde in the first game, is actually more or less the puppet appointed by Gul'dan in that lore. So we have a very different thing here, where he's actually kind of center focus of the Horde, and he's directly controlling everything. And Blackhand, who was actually kind of important in the first game for Warcraft, is very much sidelined in this one, which is part of what I'm going to get into, is that some characters in this movie are less significant than they were in the original lore, which for me was a little bit off-putting. So we have this with Gul'dan that was supposed to be a figure in the shadows, and is now right in full view for everyone. Another character I would bring attention to is Doomhammer. In the games, Doomhammer was supposed to be the one who overthrows Blackhand, and he discovers about the Shadow Council, and he ends up bringing Gul'dan into submission because he takes control of the Horde by force. You know, he challenges Blackhand, he takes him out in combat, and he learns about everything and brings it down. This Doomhammer, though, was very passive considering what we should have expected from the original lore, because that Doomhammer, he knew what he wanted, he took it, and he commanded the Horde, in the second game. So seeing what this Doomhammer was, who was, for all intents and purposes, not even in the movie all that much, considering, which is it's a very different portrayal, and it's one that kind of lacked the same kind of impact that the first game had. And that was kind of disappointing, because there was a point in this movie where Doomhammer really could have stepped up and took on the role that he was known for, but it just didn't happen. We'll go to the fate of King Lane. In the original story, King Lane, I believe, died in the siege of Stormwind Keep, because Azeroth was having to face all of the Orc clans by itself. And even though the initial attack on Stormwind Keep did not go as the Horde planned, the follow-up, eventually in the war, they did take it over, and King Lane dies in that battle. In this movie, he still dies, but the way that he dies is very different, and the context in which he dies is very different. So I think that kind of this will set off a chain. This also ties into Luther's role and the creation of the Alliance. Luther was supposed to be the person who, after King Lane dies and Stormwind Keep falls, he's supposed to take the survivors of Azeroth across the sea, where they tell their tale to the other nations, and that's what creates the Alliance. The alliance was supposed to be sparked by the tragedy of what happened to Azeroth and trying to prevent that from happening to the rest of the world. In this one, the alliance more or less just kind of gets set up because Azeroth is immediately into contact with other people, and it just kind of happens. You know, there's nobody that's expressing doubts about, like, they don't know what the Horde is. You know, it's kind of very clear as to this one. So I think in a way that is a little bit diminutive of what Luther was, because he was meant to be the survivor. He was meant to lead the other survivors, to be the thing that they kind of, the people that had lost it all, what they clung to fight back. And in this one, because of how differently this plays out, Azeroth never actually falls, and so you don't get that rising back up from the tragedy that you had in the original game lore, because that is very different. Also, the games had a variety of units, and these units were supposed to, like, evolve from one game to the next, because the idea is that the conflict between the Alliance and the Horde was actually more or less fueling all of these advances, which is why both sides were supposed to be getting better. But you don't really have that sense here because, well, most of the units that were in those games are not here anymore. For instance, the Horde no longer has its warlocks, no longer has those other mages. I actually don't remember what their names were. You don't get the spear throwers. The wolf riders are barely in this movie. Now, the wolf riders were something that had disappeared from the first game to the second, but would have actually been an interesting choice to incorporate that into the movie as to why these units may have existed in the Horde at one point and why they were no longer here. But alas, that one is not mentioned too well at all. So you kind of have that lack. You also don't have, like, the crossbowmen, or you have the horseback knights, but they're almost barely in this, even though they were actually kind of important in the first lore, because going back to the original attack on Stormwind Keep, the Orcs had two clans that attacked that city because they completely underestimated the humans. And the humans not only repelled that attack, and the Orcs were taken by surprise when the cavalry units emerged, and they were actually forced all the way back to the portal. But the cavalry is only really used in this for kind of transportation, to say, like, we're traveling around the place. You know, you didn't have, like, the big army of actual horseback knights. You only had the foot soldiers in this one. So it's a very different strategy that kind of goes into that. Another thing is the introduction of the guns. The guns are not something that were ever in the first and the second games, or even, I don't think, in the immediate follow-up to it. The guns were introduced, as far as I understand it, in the World of Warcraft, the MMO, which is supposed to be a war that is actually the third war, I believe, because I think the first game was the first war, and then you had the second war in Tides of Darkness, and so this was like the third war after all of that. So there's actually quite a leap in what the technology was between the first game and between World of Warcraft. But the guns were incorporated into this one, introducing them a lot earlier in the conflict, which I think was a little off-putting in the sense that guns feel kind of awkward in a sword and axe sort of age anyway, but it's like trying to skip a lot of what the transition was and going more closely to what other people know from the MMO. So we have a few of those differences, obviously, and I think those are going to be some more of the more important ones. There are obviously a lot of other little differences that probably emerged, like, behind the scenes. Like, this one didn't play as much an interest, or as much a focus on the woman in black that's in the movies. if I understand correctly, she's actually the Guardians' mother. And there is a whole thing regarding as to a little bit as to what her backstory was and how all this got set down its path. But she is barely in this movie, and she isn't really clear as to what her role was back then. Anyway, that was just a few of my thoughts as to what the differences were. I do feel like some of these characters were just underwhelming considering what they're supposed to be in the games, because he does become the leader here, but he becomes the leader of a people that have not been destroyed by the Horde, which is very different than leading a bunch of survivors. It's a lot less, well, it's easier to lead people that haven't lost their hope yet than to take a people that have lost everything and have them fight to reclaim what was theirs, fight to reclaim that hope that they had in them. And Doomhammer being very passive in this thing was also pretty off-putting for me, at least, because he's supposed to be the ruthless leader of the Horde. He's supposed to be the person that made Gul'dan submit, because he proved that Gul'dan's magic and the magic of his warlocks was not going to deter him, it was not going to stop him, and he overcame it. And here he's so passive, he's barely noticeable. In fact, you really wouldn't know that he even was Doomhammer if his name hadn't been dropped at one very crucial point in the movie. So, because of that, he's just really underwhelming. That being said, I think if you watch the movie and you have played the games, you will have something that you've gotten from both of them. So I would encourage you to see both and to more or less determine for yourself as to which version you liked better. But that concludes my thoughts for right now. So if you like this video and the other videos from Tnashi's Movie Corner, subscribe. And until then, peace.